On this channel, we talk about personality psychology a lot, but one thing we don't really talk about is how impactful personality psychology is, or in some cases, isn't. We know that personality can influence certain outcomes in our life, maybe regarding our work, our salary, our friendships, relationships, these sorts of things. But we don't really talk about how strong and how likely those effects are to be because of our personality. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the science and research that has gone on determining how impactful personality psychology really is and how much attention should we be paying to our personality. Let's get into it. Before we get into the specifics, we need a quick primer on what effect sizes are in statistics. In statistics, an effect size is, as the name suggests, the measure of the size of an effect of some sort of relationship between variables. Say, for example, we wanted to look at personality type and salary. We could look at the correlation between these two things, and that is a measure of the size of some sort of effect. Correlations are the most common size effect measure that we see in psychology. But there are also other measures of effect sizes, such as if we wanted to see the difference between two groups and how that impacted some sort of other variable, we could look at people who identified as an introvert versus people who identify as an extrovert and compare the differences between their outcomes in salaries and measure the effect size in that situation. So ultimately, effect size is how we know how big an impact some sort of thing is having on another thing. How are these variables related, or what differences are they providing in the outcomes that we're looking at? We can determine the strength of effect sizes by looking at the values that are given to us dependent on the style of effect size that we're measuring. So let's look at correlation, for example. So correlation scores range from -1 to 1, where 1 is called a complete correlation, meaning that as something happens, as there is an increase in one variable, there is also an increase in the other variable 100% of the time. That is a complete correlation. That is extremely rare in a lot of different sciences and pretty much unheard of in psychological sciences. There's almost a never one-to-one correlation between anything in the psychological sciences. And that might happen in like biology or physics, for example, where, the law of gravity is a one-to-one correlation on Earth, for example. If you're measuring Earth's gravity, it's going to happen 100% of the time. But in psychological sciences, this doesn't happen like that. A -1 correlation is going to be a complete correlation, but in a negative way. So as we have an increase in one variable or measure, we're going to see a decrease in another variable 100% of the time. So imagine them moving in opposite directions as opposed to closer together 100% of the time. And in the middle, we have 0. 0 represents no relationship, meaning that as something happens within one variable, whatever's happening in the other variable isn't coordinated with that. It's not changing or influenced by that first change. So, determining effect size, which is most often done through correlations in a lot of psychology, is really telling us how strongly related are the variables that we're interested in to the outcomes or variables that we're looking at on the other side. Now that we have that out of the way, we can start to look at what the research says about effect sizes in psychology as a science. And I want to start with the field as a whole so you can get an idea of not only personality, but how personality might be compared to some of the other psychological subfields that we see research being conducted in quite often. So today we're going to be looking at a paper called The Meaningfulness of Effect Sizes in Psychological Research: Differences Between Subdisciplines and the Impact of Potential Biases. This is published in Frontiers, which is a peer-reviewed journal. It's a pretty respected one. It's not like the most respected psychological journal, but it's a pretty decent journal that has published a lot of good papers. And they go into detail about how essentially each of the subfields of psychology are performing in terms of effect sizes and how those things are differing. So the main graphic that I want to bring up is this one. And this is going to show you the median effect size that is seen across the different subfields of psychology. Now, it is important to note that personality more often than not is considered part of the social or developmental side of psychology. It does dip into clinical when you're working with models and measures such as the MMPI, which are pretty much exclusively clinical measures of personality. But when we're looking at something like the 5-factor model or even MBTI, we're talking more so on the social side. So as you can see here, we have the different fields: biological, experimental, applied, multidisciplinary, clinical, educational, psychoanalysis, developmental, and social. And the effect sizes are ranging from 0.50 roughly at the highest to 0.30 at the lowest. So, a zero point 0.3 effect size in psychology is considered a moderate effect size. In some other fields, it would be considered small, but in psychology in particular, because we have smaller effect sizes overall, we generally consider zero point 0.3 to be a pretty good effect size. It's very moderate. Whereas zero point 0.5 is going to be a relatively strong effect size. It's going to be something that has shown consistency and is going to be pretty well reproducible. So it's to no surprise then that biological psychological sciences are going to have the highest effect size, meaning that they're going to be the ones that are the most reproducible and are going to show as having the highest amount of impact on the variables that they are measuring, because biology tends to be the thing that is the most consistent when we're looking at psychology and outcomes. I do want to make note of the very important fact that just because you have a strong effect size in one study doesn't necessarily mean that is going to be reproducible. And in fact, a lot of studies with large effect sizes aren't reproducible. In this same study, they compare what's called pre registration studies to non pre registration studies. As the name suggests, when you pre register a study, you're essentially telling the journal that you're going to be submitting it to exactly what you're looking for and what you're going to be measuring and analyzing before you even conduct the analysis, before you do anything with the data that you have, before you've even collected the data. Usually you're going to be telling them what it is that you're doing and how you're going to be measuring it. This is something that's growing in popularity because it increases scientific rigor. The reason that this is a problem, and the reason that you're going to see differences when you look at studies that don't have pre registration, is because what a lot of people in research will do is they'll do research, they'll get a bunch of data, they have a lot of data, and then they won't get the results that they expected. So, what they'll start doing is they'll start fishing around in the data, doing correlations that weren't originally what they were looking for, and kind of looking for things just that they can get out of their data that weren't originally being looked for, essentially. And the problem with this is that when you design a study in such a way that you're not looking for one specific relationship, it can introduce confounding variables or introduce things that are going to inflate some of the other effect sizes that you might be looking for. So, what this paper is essentially telling us is that the studies that were not pre registered were reporting higher effect sizes than the studies that were pre registered. And why is this important? It means that these were probably likely due to people or researchers who were searching or fishing for things in their data. They were searching for significant results. They were searching for strong effect sizes and relationships that weren't originally what they were setting out to look for. And the difference isn't like insanely massive, but it is quite large. As you can see, without pre registration, we have an effect size of zero point 0.6, but you'll note that zero point 0.6 is much larger than the effect sizes that we saw on the other graph, even at the highest end, which were like 0.5. Whereas with pre registration, we're seeing around zero point 0.4, which seems to be a lot more in line with what we're seeing. Ultimately, the reason that I'm telling you this is that the effect sizes that we're seeing in this study and across the field of psychology as a whole are likely to be somewhat overreported or just too strong. So even in my mind, sometimes if I'm looking at a study and I don't think that it's pre-registered or done with extreme vigor, I'm likely to be very cautious of strong effect sizes that are reported or even moderate effect sizes that are reported because we know that effect sizes in psychology aren't particularly that strong. And this is even more so true when we get down to personality. Now, looking back at the first graph that we observed, you can see that developmental and social psychology, which is where we see personality research done, usually has the smallest median effect size of all of the psychological subfields at around zero point 0.3. Knowing what we know about what we just talked about regarding pre registration and over reporting, we can probably guess that this might even be a little bit inflated, and we might see median effect sizes that are actually closer to 0.25 or maybe even zero point 0.2 because researchers are reporting things that they weren't originally setting out to look for or finding significant correlations after they've already conducted the research. And this is going to be a problem essentially because it doesn't give us an accurate depiction of how social psychology or personality psychology might be influencing or impacting certain outcomes in life. So now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about why social psychology, why personality psychology tends to be on the lower end of effect sizes. Why are we seeing smaller effect sizes in this field compared to some of the other fields of psychology? Personality is something that is ever present across the lifespan, and it's also something that develops and grows with you as you age and experience different things, meaning that you aren't just given one very specific personality that's static across the entire lifespan, and therefore it's kind of hard to measure how personality might be impacting outcomes when your personality is something that is inherently going to change. You might be someone who's relatively introverted, and as you become a teenager or an adult, you become a little bit more closer to ambiversion, or maybe even find yourself becoming more comfortable in an extroverted mindset that you were repressing or not engaging with because of something in your life. That is ultimately to say that there's a lot of different things that influence how we act, how we see our personality, and how we're going to be interacting with the world because of our personality. And these things change across the lifespan. Personality overall is going to have what I call a snowball effect on the outcomes in our life as opposed to a major direct one. So, say for example, we might not see that people who are extroverted are going to, I don't know, earn big, huge salaries compared to introverts when we just compare extroversion to salary. But when we look at the impacts that extroversion can have across the lifespan, how it's influencing other variables in smaller ways, we can see how that might then lead to something like an increase in salary. So, say for example, we have an extroverted person in a college course and we have an introverted person. The introverted person is less likely to raise their hand. Maybe they're less likely to talk to the teacher, make friends, these sorts of things. They do their own thing. The extroverted person, on the other hand, might be more likely to raise their hand. They might be more likely to ask or answer questions. They're going to make an impact on the people around them. And that might lead to developing a relationship with a professor, a professional relationship, of course, which might then lead to them having a stronger letter of recommendation, which might then lead them to getting into a better school, which might then lead them into having a better job. So it's not that extroversion itself is associated with, say, for example, having a better job or having a higher salary. It's that extroversion can lead to other things in life, which can then lead to that. This is what's called a mediating effect, or sometimes moderating, depending on how we're looking at the specifics of the interactions of the variables. Essentially, personality is having an impact that isn't a one to one direct relationship with the outcome that we're looking at. And there's these in between steps in there. And this is going to be something that's present across pretty much every personality trait. This isn't something that's exclusive to just extroversion. When we look at how, say, for example, neuroticism might play out, the person who's highly neurotic might be more likely to get upset or frustrated, which might make it harder for them to get into a relationship, which might decrease their financial stability because they don't have a romantic partner to move in with, which might make them homeless. You know, there's a snowballing effect of personality, and when we look at the direct relationship between these personality traits and these outcomes, we're not seeing these sorts of things. But when we start to introduce personality traits as these mediating variables, as these moderating variables that are in between or act as stepping stones to these outcomes, we start to get a better understanding of the effect sizes that personality can have. And even in this manner, personality isn't going to have huge effect sizes. We're not talking about, being an extrovert is very, very likely to lead to something, which will then lead to something else, which will then give you a salary increase. But it can increase your likelihood of interacting with certain things that are going to give you those different outcomes across the lifespan. And this isn't me just saying extroversion is great. There's great things about introversion as well, right? Like, if you're introverted, maybe you're less likely to go out and party on the weekend, so therefore you're more likely to study and get better grades. Do you see how these stepping stones are presenting themselves when we look at personality? It's not a one-to-one direct relationship. And that's, in my opinion, why we are seeing smaller effect sizes in the social field of psychology. And it's why we're seeing researchers who work in this field now starting to move away from direct comparisons, away from direct comparisons and more towards these indirect measures of effect. And so we can see how personality is influencing these other things that are then influencing the outcomes that we're interested in. One question that may have come up in your mind is, well, if we have the starting trait, let's say extroversion, and we have the outcome of, say, salary, why is it important that we know all of these middle steps in between when we know that essentially that extroversion might ultimately lead to that salary increase through these other things? Doesn't that mean that the effect size is just going to be relatively large there? No, because at every step of the way along this journey, when we introduce a new, middle variable, now we have other things that can also influence that variable as well. Let's look at, say, for example, extroversion, letters of recommendation, and getting into a better school. Maybe the extrovert is more likely to develop professional relationships, which will help them get that letter, which will then help them get into a better school. But another thing that could lead to getting a better letter of recommendation is simply having good connections. Maybe you know someone who knows someone. Maybe your dad is rich or wealthy or a high contributor to the school, and maybe you're going to get a better letter of recommendation through that route. At every step of the journey, when we look at these mediating models that we're developing, we have to account for all of the different variables that could ultimately lead to the outcomes that we're searching for. And what we're essentially saying when we look at personality is that these snowballing effects can lead to some of these steps along the way, but they ultimately don't necessarily have to. Not every extrovert is going to develop better professional relationships with their teachers, but some of them might, and for different reasons. But also, maybe you have some people who are getting that letter of recommendation through other reasons, like knowing someone or having a family member who's influential. And this is why it's really important to keep in mind when we're looking at effect sizes in psychology, when we're looking at how one thing relates to another, specifically with like personality, that there's a lot of different things that impact the outcomes that we're looking for, not just personality, not just what we think is the thing that's really the biggest. I might attribute a lot of my success in life to my personality, but I also have family who helps me. I've got a wife, I've got family who helped me pay for school a little bit. These are all very important things and variables that influence the type of education that we can get, how successful we might be. IQ, for example, is another thing that could be very influential outside of personality. Ultimately, what I'm saying here is that while effect sizes in personality are small, they are meaningfully impactful on a variety of different things that will snowball and continue throughout the lifespan. But all of those different things that personality can impact can also be largely impacted by other things in life. So it's important to remember that personality isn't going to have strong, direct relationships with these outcomes, and instead they act as one pathway to get to these outcomes that are going to have these smaller correlations, smaller effect sizes.